Good morning, Eric Johnson. Thank you again for joining me in discussing various mold-related things. We've dove a little bit into your history as a prototype for chronic fatigue syndrome. Last week, we did a really fun interview, well, fun for science nerds, I don't know, interesting interview that I accidentally did not record. But in that video, you mentioned to me that when the CDC came to investigate chronic fatigue syndrome. Hi.
Hi.
It's okay, Dada. Thank you. You mentioned to me that what they were looking for actually was a mutated Epstein-Barr virus. Would you care to talk about that just a little bit?
Sure. In the 1980s, doctors noticed a strange epidemic of a fatiguing illness sweeping across the United States. It was called the adult mono, or sometimes people just called it the fatigue or the chronic fatigue. And people would just fall ill for no apparent reason. Otherwise healthy people, students, teachers, no real sense to it. And the Center for Disease Control noticed that many of these people developed a chronic case of glandular fever mononucleosis, and they simply didn't recover. So they coined a new syndrome to study this phenomenon. They called it chronic Epstein-Barr virus syndrome, because Epstein-Barr virus is the causative agent for mononucleosis, the kissing disease. But they couldn't figure out why so many people were getting it and just not recovering. And Dr. Stephen Strauss and Dr. James Jones wrote separate but vaguely connected hypothesis abstracts in 1985 that speculated that the Epstein-Barr virus might have mutated, acquired some new properties, and they wanted to look into this. But the Epstein-Barr virus has an incubation period of a month. So it was responsible for sporadic disease, but didn't travel person to person like a flu does. There were no clusters. There were no contagious outbreaks, no epidemics. And in 1985, an outbreak of an infectious illness struck on North Lake Tahoe in Crime Village, made several hundred people sick. And two local doctors read about this chronic Epstein-Barr virus syndrome, which had just been published. And they tried to diagnose us with this new syndrome. And first they used an old test, the monospot test, which is very crude. It was only good for detecting an active state of Epstein-Barr virus, but that was it. And people were negative. So it didn't seem like this was the problem. A new test was unleashed right at that exact time, a brand new Epstein-Barr virus serology test, much more sophisticated. It not only told you if you had active EBV, but it would tell you how active the virus was, if you'd been previously exposed, so if it was a new case or a reactivation of an old latent infection. And they unleashed with this new test, lo and behold, the people that were previously negative were suddenly positive for this new syndrome. They called up the Center for Disease Control, explained the situation. They said, the Center for Disease Control, Dr. Gary Holmes, said, well, that's impossible because you're describing an outbreak illness. It went through town with like a flu with a 4 to 7 day incubation period going from person to person. So you probably don't have this new syndrome. Well, the testing by the Center for Disease Control's own parameters, said, yes, this is what it is. So normally the Center for Disease Control doesn't send epidemiologists out on the basis of a doctor's request. They have to work through channels from the Department of Public Health. But this procedure was bypassed because this finding was so unusual that it seemed to confirm that perhaps a new mutant Epstein-Barr virus may have struck an incline village. So they did send 2 investigators, 2 CDC epidemiologists out, and they looked at the serologies, the results of this new test. It was kind of confusing because about 2/3 of the patients diagnosed with this chronic fatigue type illness met the parameters for this Epstein-Barr virus syndrome, but the rest did not. They had different reactivated viruses or new onset viruses or bacterial infections. So it's kind of all over the map. So on one hand, we had positive evidence by the CDC's own criteria that this was an outbreak of Epstein-Barr virus syndrome, and at the same time, conflicting evidence that said it was not. Well, Dr. Paul Cheney, one of these local doctors, called me into his office and hit me with some startling news. He said, well, you're Epstein-Barr virus negative. This new test says that you were never exposed to EBV at all. No old infection, no current infection, no reactivation, nothing. He goes, I need your blood. I'm going, what for? And then he explained that the Center for Disease Control was ambivalent about this new syndrome, and that he was going to use the evidence of people who were EBV negative to show that it wasn't a reactivation of Epstein-Barr virus, that something deeper was suppressing the immune response, and that they should look for that rather than keep beating their heads against the wall looking for a mutant Epstein-Barr virus. So that's when he asked me, how would you like to be a prototype for a new syndrome?
Okay. So that's quite a bit of the EBV backstory that I didn't know, and that's really interesting because you obviously didn't test positive for EBV, which totally spun their theory. And I also had assumed, I made the assumption, you know, hearing that the CDC coined the term chronic fatigue syndrome without looking into Stachybotrys that was requested by people to look into the ventilation systems, I assumed it was a little bit more of like a sinister, like purposeful ignoring. But now I'm wondering if it was just an innocent mistake because
no, you're right. It was a sinister, deliberate suppression of evidence.
Okay. I was wondering maybe, okay. Yeah, I know that there's a lot of evidence that points to this, but okay.
Yeah, the guy that wrote the Epstein-Barr virus hypothesis, Dr. Stephen Strauss of the NIH, he was very jazzed about this new syndrome. He was going to get lots of grant funding and he was going to be in charge, and it was going to be dedicated to his concepts. It was going to be his baby. And Dr. Paul Cheney was throwing a monkey wrench into his little dream. And
oh, wow.
He was quite upset about it. Yeah. And, I mean, he was more than upset.
That sounds like that would have a good backstory to it too.
Yeah, it's the pivotal moment in chronic fatigue syndrome history, because as the Strauss theory was falling apart, he began to defend it, saying, well, perhaps Epstein-Barr virus isn't the driving force, the ultimate cause, but it's still a factor, an important factor. It's the reason why people are getting cancers and the fatigue. It's the reactivation of the Epstein-Barr virus that's important. So this new syndrome should still be dedicated to my concepts. And Dr. Paul Cheney was essentially stealing his syndrome away from him, going, oh no, we're going to look for something completely different, an entirely new cause, an unknown agent, which isn't even on the radar. And they called a meeting because the evidence accumulated by Dr. Cheney was so compelling that it couldn't be denied. I mean, here were signs of viral reactivation. These people did fit the parameters of the chronic Epstein-Barr virus syndrome. The outbreak had made national news, and the CDC had had a very public visit to Incline Village. They couldn't deny all that. So they called a meeting in 1987 to decide what to do about the situation. And just in the months prior, a new virus, a completely new and unknown virus, had been discovered by the Gallo lab called human herpes virus 6. And Dr. Cheney, Dr. Peterson sent blood from the Lake Tahoe survivors down to the Gallo lab who test positive for this new virus.
All of them did?
No, I'm trying, probably about 2/3. It was quite a few, but
Okay.
not all.
Okay.
But since this was a scary new virus that had been previously detected only in AIDS patients, that kind of gets your attention a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the guy in charge of the investigation at the CDC, Dr. Carlos Lopez of the herpes virus and viral exanthems division, called a meeting to determine what to do about this evidence of viral reactivation. And Dr. Stephen Strauss was there, and a lot of the different factions that were all fighting for their own theories, all hoping to gain control of whatever outcome this committee was going to decide. And in the middle of this, Dr. Gary Holmes, the CDC epidemiologist, hands out the Tahoe study. It was a study that he did on the Truckee teachers, on the Incline Village survivors, which showed that the Epstein-Barr virus was present in a lot of cases, but so were many other viruses. So it effectively did respond to Dr. Cheney's evidence and completely exclude EBV as a causative agent. Stephen Strauss was so upset by this that he actually got up and attacked Dr. Byron Hyde, the specialist in myalgic encephalomyelitis, who was there because he had diagnosed the Tahoe outbreak as being a typical epidemic of ME. In fact, there were 3 ME literate physicians there present in this meeting, and they were convinced that the Lake Tahoe outbreak didn't fit the vague non-epidemic Epstein-Barr virus syndrome, but it was a classic fit for myalgic encephalomyelitis.
Wow.
So Dr. Stephen Strauss started cursing the patients. Yeah,
Hey, buddy.
he's going, those fucking patients, they tricked me, those goddamn patients. What will my colleagues think? I'm ruined.
Oh, golly gee.
Yeah, Dr. Hyde tried to calm him down. And in a recent interview, Dr. Hyde said, and I'd never heard this before, I'd heard the cursing and the screaming, but apparently Stephen Strauss actually started to hit Dr. Hyde, physically hit him. That's how ballistic he was. So
What a wounded ego.
well, you know, he put years of work into this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
by having his hypothesis disproven, it was a major blow to his prestige. Now, he had come into this syndrome, this meeting, so certain that he was going to take control. I mean, he was the guy, he was the money man in charge of grant funding from the NIH.
Oh, so he had a lot to lose.
Well, he had a lot of power because he's the guy who dictates who gets the money.
Wow.
So everybody wants to kind of cozy up to him,
Yeah.
be friends with him.
Yeah.
You want grant funding? I mean, he's the main guy. So when he entered this meeting, he had several different names that he had proposed for his own new syndrome. And the one that he preferred was sporadic neuroasthenia.
Ooh, that's a good one.
It was kind of a twist on neurasthenia.
Mm-hmm.
Just put a little O in the middle, and then sporadic neuroasthenia,
Yeah.
because it was going to indicate the sporadic, non-contagious nature of the Epstein-Barr virus syndrome,
Uh-huh.
and explain that it was a neurasthenia-like disease. Well, the Tahoe outbreak was not like that. It was different viruses. There was no EBV, and it was contagious. So this handing out of the Tahoe study destroyed Strauss's plans, and from that moment on, he wanted to call it chronic fatigue syndrome.
Oh, that's who came up with the name?
Right, on the spot, he goes from a serious sounding name to a trivial sounding stupid name.
I was wondering the backstory on that because I've heard you say so many times that name was chosen intentionally to trivialize this, and that's so interesting.
Yeah, Strauss was going to, if he couldn't have the syndrome, he was going to destroy it.
Wow.
And
Wow.
the most prestigious member of the Holmes Committee, the Dr. Elliot Keefe, was warning about the vague way this new definition, Dr. Holmes' definition, was being put together. He goes, it's not specific enough, it lacks markers, it doesn't have immunological evidence written right into it. What are you trying to do? Create a new psychiatric syndrome? If you don't have a really solid basis for the syndrome, people will take it over for their own agenda. They'll hijack it. So you really need to be more specific here. Well, in response to this, instead of making it more specific, Dr. Stephen Strauss directed Dr. Gary Holmes to remove more elements from his definition and not specify that it was for the Lake Tahoe outbreak. In other words, he was deliberately doing everything he could to make sure the syndrome fell apart in confusion. So this meeting where Dr. Strauss went crazy and started screaming and attacking people and chose the trivializing name, that was to dictate the entire history of chronic fatigue syndrome from that point on.
Sorry, I had a little child noise, so I just muted myself, but that is such a fascinating story. I had always been curious on the backstory of how, like, what events transpired, because I've heard you say so many times that they trivialized it on purpose. That is so petty.
Yeah, and the Center for Disease Control could have corrected the situation at any time, and they never did.
That's just so... Okay, so my question is, like, this is just, I kind of don't want to ask this question, but I'm going to. Do you think that their response would be because it's disease control? And are they purposely ignoring this because they know it's environmental and it's so you can't control that disease?
Yes.
Oh. Oh, okay.
Yes, they're fully aware of the environmental factors. These, the toxic mold, the sick building syndrome, was strongly documented in the original Holmes investigation and is somewhat vaguely included in the Tahoe study, in the document that he handed out, which caused all the fuss.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all right there in the documents, and they know what to investigate, and they decided to keep the syndrome in confusion by simply never doing so. They know what they're supposed to be looking into. They know where we are. It's all documented, and yet their entire propaganda is that chronic fatigue syndrome has moved on. We don't know anything about that, so we've moved on since then.
Okay, that's what gets me, is that there's like, I don't even know how many millions of dollars being awarded to investigate chronic fatigue syndrome, and all they're doing is looking at new viral causes. It seems like to me, as someone who has tried to deep dive and understand the medical history of this to piece together, it seems like there's quite a few viruses in a toxic environment that would result in these type of symptoms.
Yeah, it was obvious from the start by the clustering in the sick buildings that the sick buildings had a really major role in who developed the chronic illness. And now we find that the substance in these buildings, Stachybotrys, is fully capable of suppressing immune function and throwing the door wide open to all these different secondary infections.
Okay. Here, can you eat this until I'm all done, and then I'll make you food? In a little bit, okay? I swear I feed my kids. I asked them all if they were hungry before we started, and they all didn't say they were hungry until we started. The other thing, okay, that's interesting, and that's a dark history, and I'm glad that we covered that because I think the average person wouldn't know. The other thing that we discussed last week was the CDC and Ruth Etzel. So this would be kind of along the same terms of the CDC happening across some information about Stachybotrys specifically causing poor health effects. And if I remember what you told me last week was that Ruth Etzel was investigating local pulmonary hemorrhaging in infants in Cleveland. And she actually went to the library to do some research, and she found that Stachybotrys had a history of injuring animals. And so she began that research. And at some point when she was diving into that research to see if it could be connected, the CDC, they pulled her off the case. They removed her.
Yeah, that's essentially correct.
Was that in response to her, in your opinion, was that in response to her sharing information that they didn't want known?
Well, the Ruth Etzel investigation began in 1994 with an outbreak of, as you say, pulmonary hemorrhage in infants in Cleveland. And as she conducted her official CDC investigation, she narrowed down the list of suspects and honed in on the toxic black mold. It was a common denominator in these houses. They looked at something like 300 different variables. And the one that stood out, just as it had in the chronic fatigue syndrome outbreak, was that there was water damage and mold. And she remembered hearing a colleague speak about a lecture about a toxic black mold that was mentioned in the veterinary literature.
Okay.
Famous for killing horses during the Second World War from eating moldy hay. Mm-hmm. And she did go to the library and found out the name of this mold, Stachybotrys atra, mm-hmm. and found that this was the mold that was present in many of these sick children's houses. And for several years, the Center for Disease Control took this very seriously, publicized it, in fact, announced that it looked like the causative agent had been identified.
As Stachybotrys?
Yeah.
They were owning that for a little bit? Okay.
Yeah. And everything looked great as far as publicizing the sick building syndrome and its association with toxic mold. This event put toxic mold on the map. It's what brought it out into the media. Up until that time, there was no mention of it. So in 1994, the killer black mold, the toxic mold, exploded into the public awareness. And it grew into such a huge thing that soon everybody was offering vitamins for toxic mold, Petri dish tests for toxic mold. A huge industry built up. Yeah, everybody's making a lot of money, But doctors aren't particularly interested in this for some strange reason. And from 1994 until 1998, it looked like the investigation was going to proceed and prove that Stachybotrys was a mold of extreme interest, probably the primary cause in these pulmonary illnesses, these infant deaths. And all of a sudden, the CDC just turns around 180 degrees, says everything is inconclusive. They take Ruth Etzel off the case. They give her no support. They essentially discredited her by lack of according credit. They didn't like do a study and say she was wrong, she was mistaken, this evidence is no good, nothing like that. They just said all this is so inconclusive that further study is needed. And then to keep things in confusion, they never did any further studies. So it appears that in the early 1990s, the Center for Disease Control did commission their own studies into toxic black mold, and it was a can of worms that they didn't want to have open. It was just too big of a problem, and rather than try to deal with it, study the situation, they just completely put the lid back on and tried to forget about it.
That's what I do when I make a really big mistake too.
Well, you'd think in the long term, they must surely realize that this is going to get out of the can anyway, and it has.
Yeah.
I mean, it's huge now, and they are left with a record of deliberate cover-ups and research malfeasance.
But the crazy thing is that you're still, like, not you specifically, but people are still essentially called conspiracy theorists for not trusting these large government agencies, even though the history is hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, you can just call it what you will. Collusion,
Yeah.
research, apathy, fraud, whatever name you use, it's not good. They were aware of information, and they acted in such a way as to feign ignorance.
I think it's so unbelievable for the average person, because I think the average person who kind of gets the majority of their information from the TV, they really want to trust the source of information. But as you told the history here, Eric, it seems like that's just not the case, and it's not practical. So I just want to thank you for your time in diving into the details of this story, because I know the average person doesn't know the history of this. The medical history of this isn't discussed. I don't know any human that knows the medical history of this as detailed as you do, and there's so much to disclose. So I just want to thank you for sharing your time and knowledge and experience to help educate anyone about this hidden situation. So thank you for your time.
You bet.